Hello everyone, today we talk about one of the greatest modern era monarchs, namely Francis I of France from the Valois-Angoulême house. Francis is no stranger to us on Schwerpunkt, as we really talk a lot about first half of 16th century warfare. In particular, we covered the Italian wars, the French impium fedus with the Turks, and in general, the sort of early modern European international landscape that we mostly observed from the Habsburgic standpoint. We never really made, especially manualistic history videos about the Renaissance yet, but we're actually on the way to. It's going to happen in next months. And in any case, it's important for us to consolidate such trend. The French perspective, we never really spoke. And it may seem, especially for a channel that focuses on the imperial Catholic tradition, and therefore mostly like the general support towards a unity of the Christian society, especially in the struggle against the infidels, etc., that the French do not spark. Also in other times of history, like this thing went on also under the time of Louis XIV, that later France modernizes and secularizes. I'm preparing something actually on the bloody history of the Paris Commune, as a matter of fact. So there's always this understanding that, at least among certain circles, that France is sort of evil and incarnate. Is a very sort of a British perspective on the matter. And I think that history has been unfair, not much to these deteriorating aspects that, in fact, are legitimate to point out, but the counterbalancing aspects as well, and actually an enormous deal of traditional continuity and even more incredible political and territorial maintenance and survival for a power that, as you know, at this point was actually surrounded by the Habsburgic dominions, having an advantage, however, that in fact is what stands out as far as the French monarchy is concerned since the Middle Ages. That is to say, its great coherence, cohesion, continuity, mystique, right? And there's a beautiful passage by Guicciardini that compared Charles V and Francis I's respective domains, and he points out that even though, again, yes, the Habsburgs had at this point a truly global empire, and the French were more compactly sort of limited mostly to the French mainland, right, to the French territorial continental mass. Fundamentally, this balance of power due to more scattered dominions for the Habsburgs and, in fact, the great robustness and military power of the French that are actually the more proactive ones, also in the moment in which the Habsburgic collection of inherited domains was substantiating. It was also accelerated by that. Had started the next great race for European hegemony that France will tendentially always sort of remain capable of achieving up to the contemporary era, when at least a more unified German power would sort of be more difficult to tackle, evidently enough, as contemporary history particularly shows. In any case, Francis I is such a great sovereign today. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but it's obvious that it will never be enough. We'll make many more videos about him. We haven't quite started this genre. Mostly we started making historical biographies from last year, and only at some point we covered the policy of a specific monarch. We did that really only for Edward I of England, as far as the Middle Ages are concerned. For Roman history, we did something like this for different emperors. We'll continue doing so. So at some point, we can do something similar for Francis, different parts of his policy of government. I also have something in store as far as specific campaigns are concerned, namely his ill-fated attempt at the conquest of England, as a matter of fact. And so you understand the scale, the prestige, the grandeur of France at this point in history that finds in Francis also a quite interesting incarnation. We will have now ample opportunity to understand that the very heavy nobiliary aristocratic background from which Francis emerged. This was always like the same Capetian dynasty that had always been ruling France since the 10th century, and that personally displays the characteristics that in some ways have been stereotypically attributed to probably a modern ruler, an unprejudiced Renaissance plotter and cold calculator, and somebody who would sort of find all the possible legal caveats to extricate himself from previous promise and given word. And this portrait of Francis is fairly accurate. Let's say these were more traditional rulers than we tend to normally think. Francis was definitely a very cold, stout, determined person. He knew his deal, what to do. He was also more of a warrior than Charles V, because Charles V is fundamentally the counterpart, and not just in the international arena, but also a bit more as a person, right? He was fundamentally a Burgundian gentleman, right? And he was a much more soulful, tendentially depressive figure. He had a much more romantic idea of chivalry by the degree this had already been lost in a way. And the French themselves, knowing, of course, how this had occurred, given also the relations with Francis and Chevalier Bayard, that actually knighted him on the battlefield, just for telling you, like, a famous name whose life was cut short by the new firearms, and that rose to sort of an archetype of the knight killed by modernity, and so something that here and so on. So I will try not to make much of this rhetoric along the way, but really Francis' figure is quite fascinating and really worth being profoundly observed. So Francis I of France was born on September the 12th, 1494, at the Château de Cognac in the province of Saintonge, then part of the Duchy of Aquitaine. This location in western France, known for its brandy production in later centuries, placed him in a strategically positioned noble holding of his own. The only son of Charles of Orléans, Count of Angoulême, and Louise of Savoy, Francis entered the world as a member of a cadet branch of the Valois dynasty with no immediate prospect of succession to the throne, which is interesting enough. Now, Louise of Savoy is a key figure. She was born on September the 11th, 1476, at Pont-d'Ain, as daughter of Philip II, Duke of Savoy, and Margaret of Bourbon, playing a pivotal role in guiding her son's path through political acumen and court influence. We're also very similar. They had this sort of precise, sort of stout, solid, like, firm behavior. Raised herself in a similar situation under the influential regent Anne de Boisjeu. After her mother's early death, Louise instilled in Francis a deep appreciation for Renaissance learning and statecraft. This is also, again, what makes Francis the man that he is. He will develop a veritable obsession for everything Italian. It's really Savoy was not Italy, but it controlled mostly, like in the core land, an Italian domain. And as you know, Italy at this point is probably the beating heart of modern Europe, right? In language, in technique, in statecraft, in basically every field possible and imaginable. I can spoiler that I'm preparing a video about sort of a military history of Leonardo, as a matter of fact, and as you know, has, as we'll see today, further specific ties, very close ties with Francis. And Francis is well instructed by his parent to the extent that, that critical moments of his reign will show. Widowed at 19 in 1496, when her husband died of tuberculosis, Louise had taken direct charge of the Angoulême household finances, which were initially strained, and moved the family between Cognac, Angoulême, and Romorantin while building alliances at the royal court. She personally selected tutors and oversaw a curriculum for her son that makes chivalric literature like the works of Jean Froissart. If you're interested in him, he was the greatest medieval French chronicler, even though he was Flemish. And so a pillar of properly medieval historiography and the times of the Hundred Years' War that actually had been over only from a couple of generations, with, however, and most importantly, emerging humanist texts. Right, if you're interested in humanism, I also have obviously a playlist that is growing on that. While shielding her son more practically and dangerously from the full intrigues following the suspicious death of Charles VIII in 1498, that, as you know, had also invaded Italy 4 years before, giving birth, so to say, causing the breaking out of the so-called Italian wars that Francis will essentially step into and contribute to have the peak of the saint reached. His father died when Francis was scarcely 2 years old, as we've seen, 1496, leaving the boy under the effective guardianship of his mother and the broader Orleans household, with the head of that house, Louis, acting as a guiding presence until Louis himself ascended as Louis XII, King of France, in 1498. And Louis XII was in fact previously known as the Duke of Orleans. Again, we're talking the highest nobility of the kingdom. He had secured the throne after the death of Charles VIII without male heirs, marking a smooth transition within the Valois line. And this elevation, rooted in Salic law principles favoring male succession, transformed Francis from a provincial noble into the primary heir presumptive of Louis from a day to another. This transition elevated Francis's position, granting him also the Duchy of Valois as an appanage which was worth of a prince. Francis was not a Dauphin because the Dauphin, as you know, is the heir apparent as the older son of the king. This was not the case, this situation. Under the joint oversight of Louis of Savoy and Marshal Pierre de Rangé, his upbringing emphasized an education befitting a potential sovereignty, encompassing Latin, history, Italian, and Spanish, alongside training in the martial exercises and courtly skills necessary, still at that time, very much for leadership. In fact, even though we are in the modern age, the St. Francis will prove by exposing himself excessively in battle and creating one of the most complicated international situations as a country, also one of the most difficult for France at that point, as we will see later, and as you already know, like that, still in the Renaissance, of course, leading from the front, even for essentially the most statally advanced country of the era, was accepted as a risk, right? It was even necessary for the very highly chivalric and aristocratic tradition of the French monarchy and establishment and nobility. Louis, as we were saying, personally oversaw much of this curriculum, commissioning texts and emphasizing Italian Renaissance ideas alongside chivalric traditions, and so fostering in Francis both intellectual curiosity and a flair for grand display that defined his later court. Right, he will spend a fortune for also having very updated Renaissance model library that actually heavily affected French finances. As a matter of fact, that this was part of his upbringing, and the idea of power as knowledge and transferred in the imperium and royal prerogatives was actually very strong at the time, and especially at Francis's court. Francis demonstrated also early physical prowess in wrestling, riding, and hunting large game in the forests around Cognac, often neglecting deeper Latin grammar for memorizing ballads and tales of knights errant, while his circle of companions from provincial nobility trained with him in mock tournaments using blunted lances. He developed a lifelong habit of rising early for physical activity and a distinctive handwriting style that makes elegant italic with bold flourishes. A veritable synthesis of the major cultures of the era. All right. This Renaissance-influenced curriculum, blending classical learning with chivalric ideas, prepared him for both intellectual and military leadership in an era when Italian humanism was increasingly shaping French elite culture. Where I also made a video about the sort of the French way to Roman law from Bolognese tradition. If you're interested in that, there is a great deal of state building and compaction at this time. which is unsurprising for the tendentially hegemonic, attemptably hegemonic country in Europe. Francis grew up surrounded by companions drawn from these noble families such as Robert de la Marck, Anne de Montmorency, Philippe de Chabot, and Guillaume Gouffier de Bonnivet, who shared in his pursuits of hunting, jousting, and military preparation, instilling values of camaraderie and personal valor. This bond proved critical later, as Montmorency rose to Grand Master of France and Constable, Chabot became Admiral, and Bonnivet commanded naval forces, creating a tight faction that dominated military appointments until factional rivalries emerged in the 1530s anyway, but still having provided with a sort of a solid background for France's reign before, and being based on this sort of youthful friendship. In fact, these lifelong companions truly played a key role in military and administrative affairs in France's reign, forming the most loyal inner circle. By 1505, Louis XII, lacking male heirs and mindful of dynastic continuity, formally betrothed Francis to his daughter Claude, the heiress to Brittany. This was incredibly important historically because, as you know, Brittany had fundamentally escaped the centralistic policies of France up to this point, and beyond, actually, because she brought Brittany herself, with her personal title on it, so not quite an annexation in the French crown. And you have the engagement solemnized in 1506, the marriage celebrated in May 1514, because we're still young, following the death of the Queen Anne of Brittany, that was already, in fact, the one who had successfully preserved the Duchy of Brittany for her daughter in succession. Interesting. That's a very complicated history. If anything, I made a video about the Duchy of Brittany, but we hinted at, we entered in the first half of the 16th century to explain how the story ended, right? But still, this was fundamentally an autonomous power. Claude of France, Claude in French is identical for male and female, as a matter of fact, just by the adjectives that you differentiate. 1499-1524 brought the important Duchy of Brittany into closer union with the French crown through this match, anyway, strengthening territorial cohesion. Physically delicate with a pronounced limp for scoliosis, she provided Francis, however, with 7 surviving pregnancies despite her frail health, dying, eventually exhausted, at age 24 only. Shortly after Francis returned from the Italian wars, by the way. This union helped consolidate, in any case, the French power. Francis lived at court from 1508, receiving honors as both presumptive heir and son-in-law, and upon Louis XII's death on the night of December the 31st, 1514 to January the 1st, 1515, he assumed the throne without contest at the age of 20. His coronation took place at Reims Cathedral on January the 25th, of the same year, where he was anointed with the sacred oil of Clovis and received the crown and scepter in a ceremony that lasted several hours amid winter snows as well. So it's a very mystical moment. If you're interested in the history of Reims, I made an entire video on its medieval part. And the ceremony there was steeped in fact, this sacred idea of kingship dating back to time immemorable, not even the same Clovis, reinforcing the, in fact, divine legitimacy of Francis' rule. The realm Francis inherited stood at a moment of notable economic vitality and administrative consolidation. The long internal peace, equitable legislation, and prudent fiscal policies of preceding reigns had fostered prosperity, while the monarchy rested on a solid administrative framework and an emerging national consciousness. This was reflected at all levels of government. France had recompacted itself, especially under the reign of Louis XI, had acquired large parts of what had been still claimed now as the Habsburgic legacy, the Duchy of Burgundy, namely. You have, in fact, the fundamental stabilization of the territorial framework that had historically been threatened by especially the English during the Hundred Years' War. You have a great cooptation of the major urban centers, especially in the provinces, that are competing to receive honors and favors from the monarchy by supporting its policies and sustaining the court itself during the various tours of the kingdom from the side of the monarchs. So this is a massive territory that, after a very long time of instability, has come back on the wings also of some general revival of European demographics and economy, massive agricultural resources, massive manpower and labor force, as a matter of fact. Also, a very feudal hierarchy, however, that in fact is what partially creates discontent among the nobility when the king tries to expand the French state that, since the other times of great expansion in the 13th century under Louis IX, had started in fact co-opting third estaters to create on the longer run a noblesse de robe as opposed to a noblesse de paix. And so for how powerful France was, there were still some important delicately internal balances that will also create issues in times of great strains, like during the Italian wars. No European monarchy, however, surpassed France at this point. In material wealth, dynastic stability, governmental authority, it was a paradigm of statehood, right? Unlike any other nation. At accession, France had roughly 16 million inhabitants, the largest population in Europe west of the Urals, with thriving grain production in the Paris Basin, the beating heart of French grandeur, wine exports from Bordeaux and Burgundy, and textile industries in Lyon and Rouen that generated substantial tax revenues through the taille and aide, right? France's accession as a vigorous young ruler of intelligence and vigor was greeted with optimism, evoking the promise of a radiant dawn. And so, just like in the traditional classical echoes of the Renaissance and humanism, like as a true divinizing sovereign that could start, in fact, a new age of universal prosperity as far as at least French expansionist policies were concerned. This enthusiasm reflected France's recovery from the Hundred Years' War that had alarmed, in fact, her neighbors, and it had been clear that her position as one of Europe's most populous and prosperous kingdoms was to open to a new phase of expansion, as the French had historically always done. And in fact, by the end of the Hundred Years' War, and in fact even before the annexation of different Burgundian states, there was a massive international rewiring that mostly mirrored what will happen also in the posterior centuries, namely a greater grand alliance to contain French expansionism. It was immediately understood that after the 100 Years' War, France would recompact and would vie for Italy. This is also part of the reason why the Italians create the Italic League and the Peace of Lodi, that had at this point also fought against the French. If you look at the Battle of Fourneau, it was a bloody draw from both sides. But it was obvious that, also obviously the German states would really analyze this from an Habsburgic perspective, were to be partially hegemonized in the West by the French. That England was always on war footing with France in a way or another, that France that, however, would threaten the Saint Tudors with her Scottish alliance. The main puzzle for the French was, however, Spain. Spain had been at least dynastically unified in the other major power in Europe that was quickly rising through the same Italian wars to a position of veritable hegemony, especially in the Mediterranean sector, that would be employed, in fact, to infiltrate the French frontier at different times. Like there would be Spanish armies entering France down the line. So this sentiment of French sort of superiority and aggressiveness found early confirmation in France's remarkable military campaign of 1515, which revived, in fact, the Italian designs of Louis XII. At some point, the French had taken sort of some beatings, they had been stopped, they had suffered setbacks. At times, they had been more successful. And as you know from a broader historical, international, dynastic background, these Italian ambitions of the French stemmed from earlier Valois claims to the Duchy of Milan. We explained this as far as in the video about Gian Galeazzo Visconti and the marriage of Valentina with the Duke of Orleans back in the day. The Kingdom of Naples, that had historically been Angevin since the time of Charles the First of Anjou. And so this was all rooted in inheritance disputes with other royal houses from the late 15th century, in particular, where France, in fact, could probably step into these very regions to make those claims manifest, right? Besides the broader Valois-Orléans interests, right, the various connections that Louis XII and Charles VIII had with, in fact, various Italian houses, the greater target was the fragmented Apennine Peninsula, rich in trade, culture, and strategic city-states, incredibly rich, but also incredibly divided, and therefore a very important target for the French. Francis financed the expedition 1515 partly through loans from the Lyon bankers. They were actually largely Italian, interestingly enough. And so obviously there were some pro-French Italian factions in the south. There were also contributions from Louis, mustering 23,000 infantry, including elite Gascon crossbowmen, and 20,000 Landsknechts under experienced captains. The latter were a bit the point of it all. The French normally hired the Swiss, the Germans, because they had not historically developed a strong national infantry, and they will actually lag behind to the point of likely causing, at least as a tip of the balance, not a decisive factor, the same French defeat in the Italian wars, right? And the reason being that the French aristocracy was afraid of essentially hiring large amount of native French soldiers that would, when discharged, constitute a combative sort of veteran force within the same France that historically, if you think about the Jacquerie and also the later French Wars of Religion, the Fronde, the same French Revolution, like originally it did create some problem. There were some attempts, actually Francis will create the so-called legions of France. I discussed this in the video about, in fact, the few French national infantry of this period that would probably also mirror the fact that France lacked the structure to, not the resources actually, but sort of the institutional framework to properly establish and maintain effective infantry forces. However, the French were pretty great at cavalry, as you know, with their gendarmes. They had the largest artillery park in Europe, as Charles VIII had successfully proven during its almost unopposed march across the Apennine Peninsula back in 1494, and hiring some German mercenaries that, when discharged, would actually go back to Germany, Switzerland, depending what we're looking at, was actually a very effective, like cost-effective, beneficial way for the French to go. Now, assembling a formidable force in the Dauphiné, so we are, as you know, in southeast France, so at the border with Italy, comprising heavy cavalry, Gascon infantry, and Landsknecht. And the Gascons were historically, as you know, it's the land of the Bidot, of all these kind of militia, of sort of scoundrels, of ragamuffin soldiers that have, however, proven very effective in terms of combativeness, of hunger, from many centuries, from the Middle Ages. That would do, and coming from a peripheral area, it was obviously not threatening the integrity of the French monarchy, even in case of rebellions, even though the boundaries with Spain were contested in part through this local factionalism as well. Francis advanced through the Alps via the lesser-known Stura Valley route, advised by Gian Giacomo Trivulzio. There was an Italian commander, bypassing Swiss defenses. Right, Gian Giacomo Trivulzio is important because he represents, again, one of these pro-French Italians. He was an experienced Milanese condottiero in French service already, providing crucial knowledge of Alpine passes in particular, right? Because these territories were, from the other side, controlled by the Duchy of Milan, the Grand Duchy of Milan. The confrontation at Marignano on September the 13th, 1515, unfolded over nearly 2 days of intense fighting, pitting Franco-Venetian forces against Swiss mercenaries supporting Maximilian Sforza. All right, so there is a bit, as you know, political context here that you need to know. But essentially, the Sforza had been ousted by the French after having actually called them into Italy. And at this point, the Venetians are actually with the French to curb the temporary coming back of the Sforzas that were Venice's arch enemies. At this point, Sforza's backed by the Swiss. In fact, the reason why the French here do not employ Swiss infantry, but they're sort of arch enemies, lots of arch enemies for everybody involved. Everybody was, to an extent, Landsknechten from the empire, was that here we're in the phase where the Swiss actually had the capacity to hegemonize Lombardy. And with the Battle of Marignano, it was a bloody defeat of theirs. However, they probably saved their own future as one of the most successful and especially richest country in the world, right? Because maintaining Milan and Lombardy would have brought the Swiss Confederacy towards a completely different direction, right? So the Battle of Marignano is actually quite famous, and we will make surely a video about this, because we need really to start making more 16th century proper battles, tactical reconstruction. Marignano is near modern Melegnano, southeast of Milan, and so Francis, personally leading cavalry charges and earned knighthood on the field, as we were saying before, from the renowned Chevalier Bayard. This is basically the French Rambo of the situation. If you look at this guy's military curriculum, I really want to make a video about him to explain that you understand this. You even wonder, how could a person like this exist? And Marignano was a clash pitting traditional Swiss pike formations against innovative French artillery and cavalry tactics. Actually, the point was, as we explained countless times on Schwerpunkt, is that the Swiss did not develop any fundamentally competitive military system in the longer run, because they developed just the pike. They had no shot, they had no combined arms fundamentally. So this ends up in one of the bloodiest battles of the era, ending Swiss dominance in European mercenary warfare for a time, at least. They would stay around, but their decline would at some point become readily inevitable as pike and shot warfare fully developed under the edges of these major monarchies, right? The Swiss, as you know, had emerged with a very strong communal ethos against sort of quote-unquote monarchs in the form of the Habsburgs, but would eventually end up ironically selling their services not just to the single most aristocratic country in Europe, it was France, but also actually getting beaten by that and by their German counterpart, so to say, in this sort of twist of fate. Now, contemporary accounts describe Francis fighting on foot even after his horse was killed, which wouldn't be the last time, by the way, with French artillery under Guyot de Gunillac firing over 2,000 cannonballs that shattered Swiss squares on the second day. Right, they remained quite exposed. The field against this sort of not necessarily point blank, fire, but still like hammered without much capacity, in fact, to intervene otherwise. And so this led to 8,000 Swiss dead and the capture of Milan by September the 15th. France's personal leadership in the cavalry charges, combined with effective artillery and Venetian support, the Venetians bit the Swiss hard here as well, secured a comprehensive triumph that delivered Milan into French hands and earned the battle its designation as the Battle of Giants. Right, this victory not only reestablished French predominance in northern Italy, but also compelled Pope Leo X to negotiate at Bologna, where Chancellor Antoine Duprat finalized the Concordat of 1516. And this, in fact, is known as the Concordat of Bologna, replacing the earlier pragmatic sanction of Bourges by granting the French king extensive rights to nominate bishops and abbots in France, while allowing the papacy certain incomes and oversight. As you know, I made a video about the Gallican Church. If you're interested in this further autonomization of the French Church from Rome, still remaining Catholic. There would be strains in the following generations, as you know, but there was the strengthening of royal control over the national church and balancing papal and monarchical authority for over 2 centuries. From the Concordat. We'll talk perhaps about France's religious views, because at some point the sovereign did contemplate, it was initially somehow warm towards Calvinism. They even thought, okay, in this scenario, like, why don't we turn Protestant? Like, we are aligning ourselves with the Turks in order to beat the Habsburgic expansionism. That's the empire that, at least more often than not, sides with the papacy. During the Italian wars, as you know, everything happens at a point. Everybody changing side. As we've seen, the Marignano cocktail is also somehow unique on its own. But eventually this was discarded. But it tells you how, even under, like, you can say the facade, sort of the essence, of course, of a most Catholic country like France, there were quite truly Renaissance, modern-minded kind of political pragmatism as far as ecclesiastical policy was concerned. Right? You can't think even the Tudors were particularly vibing with Protestantism per se, but it was, at least in the moment, for them quite shrewd and useful to create the Anglican schism and everything that followed. Now, the Concordat is also some sort of continuity of almost Ghibelline wealth struggle, because even though the French had historically remained allied with the papacy, you know very well the relation between Philip IV and Boniface VIII, and the pragmatic sanction of Bourges had prevented, up to the Concordat of 1516, to affirm the king's right to nominate bishops and abbots. And so now, this was the old investiture controversy, nothing more, nothing less, obviously in this Renaissance sauce. In any case, the Concordat also represented the culmination of efforts by Charles VII and Louis XI, embedding oversight over the French church and serving as a cornerstone for the further expansion of monarchic power in the kingdom. In practice, this allowed Francis to appoint loyalists like Duprat himself to the See of Saint and control over 120 bishoprics, generating substantial revenue while reducing papal interference in French internal affairs. Francis's reign unfolded against a backdrop of shifting European alliances, as we were just noticing, but in particular the ascent of a formidable rival. And we already told it before. The death of Emperor Maximilian I in 1519 opened, in fact, the imperial election in Germany, in which Francis competed against Charles of Habsburg, who had recently unified Spain, the Netherlands, and Austrian lands under his nominal personal dynastic rule. As you know, we're talking about Charles V as already ruling vast territories as King Charles I of Spain, as the son of Philip the First, the son-in-law of the most Catholic kings of Spain, creating this powerful encirclement of French lands, right, between Germany and the Iberian monarchies. This Habsburg consolidation under Charles V created a massive strategic puzzle. France, from the Pyrenees to the Low Countries and beyond, risked some more direct enemy invasion. This will fuel decades of rivalry. Much of what will unfold here in Italy again, and later also in the Netherlands, will effectively stem from this. Despite extensive diplomatic maneuvering, including bribery funded through loans from the Fugger banking house and initial papal backing from Leo X, Francis's candidacy faltered due to Charles's superior resources and the elector's preference for a German prince. But Francis admittedly came close to gain the Holy Roman Imperial crown. This, as you know, is nothing strange. There had been already historically non-German rulers elected also in Germany as kings of the Romans, as emperors, and the overall matter was mostly one of money, right? Essentially, there was, yes, some sort of loser German national feeling about sort of a French monarch not being perhaps the most advised, for Germany. This is very relative, depending on what kind of policies would have actually been pursued. We've seen that at the time of Louis XIV, there were lots of Protestant Germans that were sort of happier under the French than under the Catholic Habsburgs, and even sort of undermining their fort against the Ottomans, as a matter of fact, as France actually does for her own purpose. In any case, the Habsburgs have the better bankers. That at some point, the Fugger will go bankrupt. They have to switch to the Bank of St. George in Genoa. From the other side, we've seen the Lyon bankers. And this was a significant setback for Francis. Charles's unanimous election as Charles V on June the 28th, Charles V is Holy Roman Emperor, June 28, 1519, intensified the strategic encirclement of France, prompting Francis to seek counterbalances. The 1520 summit at the Field of the Cloth of Gold with Henry VIII of England is essentially a consequence of this. This was organized with elaborate pomp, including golden pavilions and tournaments in the typical sort of Renaissance grandeur and expenses, as a matter of fact, aiming at forging an alliance between the French and the English, which, as you understand, may, on this occasion, prove a diplomatic success externally, but it wouldn't end up having great political substance, as, in fact, Henry soon aligned with the same Charles. And we made some videos about the Tudor army in general to explain also many circumstances in which Henry VIII intervened in Flanders, fundamentally against the French, next to his relative Charles. As a matter of fact, Henry would have been Charles's uncle, as a matter of fact, even though he was younger than him. As you see here, Charles was born in 1500, so Francis was also barely older. So you have this sort of these great rulers of Europe involved, in fact, in this quite delicate balance of power. And the Field of the Cloth of Gold was essentially an extravagant meeting near Calais, which obviously had a meaning here. Calais was still in English hands at this point, since the times of the 100 Years' War. We are in the Val d'Or, specifically, between Guînes and Ardres. The field featured lavish tents woven with gold thread, hence like the cloth of gold, jousting, wrestling matches between the same kings, feasts, and artistic displays that exemplified the Renaissance opulence but failed to, again, secure any lasting anti-Habsburgic pact between the two channeled countries. On this occasion, also, this may seem strange to whoever has never gotten interested in this by familiar legacy. I was bombarded as a kid with these kind of details, but are very funny incidents. Whereas there is a sense of courtesy, of brotherhood, this very traditionally shared sense of, especially among the elite, that those at the top are really similar. They're really bound by a common metaphysical dimension, and spirituality. This helps reinforcing their authority, their legitimacy. There is a lot of competition at the same time. So you have this initial meeting between Francis and Henry that literally galloped gaily, holding hands, followed by the respective French and an English retinueman in all this, ending up actually in quite a context, because as in one of the ensuing wrestling competition, Francis absolutely laid Henry out flat on his back, and this apparently actually caused a great anger in the English sovereign. This man, again, as we've seen, they had a specific. They were also both quite athletic and strong, but Francis was apparently better, and this stemmed from the aforementioned knightly training that these noblemen had as heirs and rulers, eventually to obviously perform even more and better than their at least the rest of their subjects. While over 3,000 nobles attended, by the way, in front of these spectacles, with banquets, by the way, consuming 20,000 fish and vast quantities of wine. This is truly the Renaissance splendor, the splendor of the elite of the Ancien Regime. The event cost both crowns enormous sums, yet collapsed when Henry signed the Treaty of Bruges with Charles V in 1521, where also hostilities commenced. All right, so the competition is such that this is a chance to show off, and France and England there compete for who actually invests more. But this is actually a massive expense in and of itself. But never as much as war, right? You have French operations in Navarre at that point, that is into Charles' possessions in Iberia, and along the Meuse in the northeast, so at the frontier with the empire, meeting mixed results, by the way. The defection of the Constable Charles de Bourbon in 1523 is particularly relevant. As you know, the Bourbon, made a video about the House of Bourbon, was a veritable state within the state, located in the very heart of France. It constituted like one of those princely domains that the crown had not yet successfully managed to absorb, and the Bourbon eventually escapes France, but he sides essentially with the Imperials. The cause being inheritance disputes with the Saint Louis of Savoy, and therefore with her son Francis, further in this sense weakening the French position, because you had this massive territory in your very national heartland that at some point sort of turned rogue, and allowing, by the way, imperial forces under Prospero Colonna to consolidate control in Lombardy as a consequence of the French destabilization. Francis responded with this Italian crisis with a major expedition in 1524, crossing the Alps with over 40,000 men. This is big war, right? And capturing Milan, in fact, before besieging Pavia, right? This actually, there is, as you know, the imperial invasion of Provence. Today we don't have time to look at all this, but so there is a trail of specific military events that happen in succession. And you know how in Pavia, outside Pavia, February the 24th, 1525, imperial troops launched a dawn assault through breaches in the Visconti Park walls. French heavy cavalry effective at Marignano proved in this closer space vulnerable to combined arquebuses and Landsknecht tactics that were essentially Spanish and Germans cooperating at their best. If you're interested, I made a video about Gonzalo de Cordoba. I also made a video about Giovanni delle Bandanere that is gravitating here around. And this, as you know, was a disaster. We talked about this in the video about the Italian wars, and we will, again, also make, obviously, a video on the Battle of Pavia that is incredibly messy, but also quite instructive regarding the sort of what real warfare looks like exactly in this almost incomprehension what is going on, not just by surprise only. Fog of war resulting in catastrophic losses for the French exceeding 10,000, including many commanders. All right. Many commanders, by the way, at this point, were kind of left there. Some managed to steal their corpses, bringing them to France. You can imagine in which conditions. And most famously and importantly, Francis himself, wounded and unhorsed, and almost killed actually and there are different versions of who actually downed him, etc. But he was not immediately recognizable among the other French gendarmes. Obviously, whoever attacked them knew that these were the cream of French cavalry, but you could not know in all this highly competitive, high nobiliary context whether that guy was the king or not. In any case, he was recognized because many others were killed in spite of their value, and surrendered to Lannoy. Right, his captivity beginning at Pizzighitone and continuing in Madrid, where he was brought. And so this came as a complete shock to the St. Charles V, that obviously gained enormously from the imperial victory at Pavia, and there is probably a new phase of the Italian wars that opens, but also found himself in a pretty sort of delicate situation himself, because having the French king as prisoners in your hands had something happen to him, which was almost the case, as Francis, as we'll see now, got sick and was about to die in captivity. It would have sort of created enormous issues. Captured after his horse fell in the mud near the park walls, Francis wrote his famous letter to his mother, Louise, from captivity, stating, "De toutes choses ne m'est demeuré que l'honneur et la vie." That is to say, everything is lost save honor and life. And this, imagine like even a mother reading that in that circumstance, and with all the problems that were immediately arising in the St. France because of the capture of her king. And so it's a moment, one of the many big watersheds in modern history. Francis also suffered from a facial wound and dysentery, by the way, during months in Spanish prisons. Naturally, he was treated with regard. Charles V actually visited him, comforted him, especially as he was about to die of fever. Like, you had Charles being at his bed, holding his hand and hoping for him not to die, all this kind of stuff. At some point, I don't remember here when it actually happened, but Francis and Charles slept together, even like not during captivity, but as brothers. Like, and this renewed alliances will happen later against the Turk only by name, because Francis would immediately pull out with an excuse or another. But they literally, like, as true masters of Europe, like, they were calling each other brother. And I imagine, I don't know if you look at the portraits of this man. I mean, Francis had a monstrous nose. French kings had the capacity of very big noses. But as you know, Charles V had prognatism as well. He could barely chew because his jaw was, so his mouth was misaligned, and he had difficulties to even properly speak well. So imagine these guys with their nightgowns and caps, like sleeping with those kind of facial features. It's kind of sort of so funny, but this truly is actually a level of traditional brotherhood and sacred sort of dual heavenly projection, right? The Battle of Pavia is obviously very important in the history of the art of war. It highlighted the declining effectiveness of traditional heavy cavalry against combined firearms and infantry formations in early modern warfare. I made lots of videos on this topic. Check especially the Spanish army that there set the gold standard, but it was still in theory, right? The Tercio was yet to be born. Also, Gonzalo de Cordoba's pike and shot tactics were here being effectively employed, but let's say also Renaissance warfare has its own specific gestation, right? Doesn't immediately get born with those characteristics from a day to another. But Pavia, in fact, is almost a, again, we can't say accidental battle, but again, the deployability of those German pikemen and Spanish arquebusiers was not to be given for granted, just as much as the actual effectiveness of these tactics, because it doesn't actually take only to deploy pike and shot warfare or to surprise the French. In this sense, you also have to withstand the shockingly traumatic French gendarme heavy cavalry charges that will have not been forgotten by anyone who happened to survive them. So remember always, cavalry did actually charge into the pikes, all right? And they normally did break them. This had been the case up to this point. It's mostly the combination of pike and shot, in fact, that makes the difference, as we've seen before also what happened to the Swiss columns at Marignano. In all this, however, French recovered, and negotiations yielded the Treaty of Madrid in January 1526, compelling Francis to cede Burgundy, renounce Italian claims, and deliver his sons as hostages while agreeing to marry Eleanor of Austria, that was Charles's sister. And you understand why this was the case. Essentially, Charles sort of made the most of the situation, also by thinking that this sort of quite widely publicized international deal would sort of be maintained by Francis once freed and leaving as hostages his sons. Instead, like, Francis would essentially justify himself in resuming hostilities against the empire by claiming that these conditions had been signed by him under pressure, so as he wasn't free. So, first of all, Burgundy. This was the old issue, as we hinted at before, of the Habsburgic lands. The Burgundian inheritance had remained essentially just in the form of Flanders, right, in the north, but had also not been reconquered by the French in the meanwhile. The Duchy of Burgundy would never actually be recontrolled by the Imperials, but there is the Franche-Comté and other territories, and we will talk about this better in other videos, in the frontier. There was also this ambiguity, because to the degree, in fact, Charles was controlling at a point some domains, some fiefs that belong, in fact, to the French kingdom. Francis tried to patronize him by claiming that Charles the Emperor was a vassal of his, or of some sort. And particularly important were the renunciations to the Italian claims, because as far as Naples, Milan, these were de facto the most important centers, and the ones that now the Spanish had taken over. As you know, southern Italy was, in fact, with the beginning of the Italian wars, reinvaded by the French, but eventually recovered by the Spanish, who already controlled it from the mid-15th century, whereas Milan now, it was part of the empire, but was manned by the Spanish, that were the rampant power here. Like the Germans had barely much resources to devolve to these tasks, and they had their own problems still continuing with Venice. In all this, as you know, Charles's brother Ferdinand remains ruling in Austria, because Charles normally rules from Spain. That obviously is the most important of his domains in power, in geographical projection as well. This is also part of the reason why the Burgundian Netherlands, as part of the Holy Roman Empire, would actually be given to Spain out of prestige, out of fact that they were the Burgundian inheritance itself. So were developing areas. And so all what will follow from that. Also, the marriage with Eleanor was quite interesting, because she apparently liked him, and Eleanor was not so particularly charming, but she was a good woman. And so it's very sad that Francis, as part of these quote-unquote forced agreements with Charles, would sort of keep her on the side. By the way, Francis had all a set of sentimental affairs. He was plenty of lovers, and so this is also very Renaissance French kind of in attitude. Now, freed in March 1526, he re-entered France at Saint-Jean-de-Luz and promptly repudiated the treaty upon reaching Cognac, his native land, asserting, in fact, this treaty's invalidity under duress. Saint-Jean-de-Luz, by the way, is this Basque coastal town marking Francis's symbolic return to French soil. Right, this stance aligned with Pope Clement VII's absolution and the formation of the League of Cognac at that point, uniting France, the papacy, Venice, Florence, and England, right, quite an array, in opposition to imperial dominance. And the League of Cognac is the direct consequence of the imperial Spanish victory at Pavia. At this point, Charles is sort of overpowered, and so even the papacy turns its back on him. And so you have this alignment, including, again, England actually signing against the emperor, and in France guiding, obviously, as the strongest power, the coming back, so to say, of its own power on the scene. As you know, this war will turn into disaster for many reasons. You have already the Reformation sweeping the land. By the way, you have many Lutherans among the Landsknechten that have sort of deep hatred for any sort of universal and clerical order. So you have the ensuing campaign seeing French forces under Odet de Foix reclaiming parts of Lombardy. But there is also the imperial sack of Rome in 1527. This was led, interestingly enough, by Bourbon's troops after his death in the assault, which was the literal degeneration of the imperial expedition against the papacy that, as we've seen, had betrayed the empire, that, however, the St. Charles V had not ordered or wanted. There was, of course, warfare going on. We've seen it also in the video about Giovanni de' Medici, as a matter of fact. But the sack of Rome by the Germans, but particularly the Spanish, you would think, as we just said, that the Lutherans, serving actually a Catholic empire, but having great hatred against the papacy in general, would be the most violent. It turns out actually that the Spaniards were the worst in that. As you know, the sack of Rome was by far one of the greatest tragedies in the history of mankind, and it came as an utter shock to Charles V, that was, by the way, feasting his firstborn son, Philip, the future Philip II, and at the news of his own troops mutinying for lack of pay. This was sort of chronically typical, especially for the Landsknechten, but also other more sort of nationally ordered and sort of better paid forces in the profanation of Rome. Charles aborted festivities, obliged all the court to wear black, and this was, again, a massive stain on his reputation, because he was the emperor in charge, the most holy Roman emperor. So this was a total disaster for a couple of reasons. Interestingly enough, during the siege of Castel Sant'Angelo, famously enough, during the sack, aside you have this incredible pages of military history with the Swiss Guard being cut to the very last to defend the Pope by the invaders. It's if you visit Rome today, it's by essentially the cemetery of the Teutonic cemetery. We know the exact spot in which they fought till the very last. Their commander was also killed in bed as he was wounded by a Spanish leader, and you have like this very sort of terrible moments. And during the siege of Castel Sant'Angelo, famously enough, the Bourbon traitor from the imperial side was killed, allegedly cut in half by a falconet shot operated by Benvenuto Cellini, one of the sort of polymatic, or at least sort of quite technically gifted sort of authors of the time, that was defending the walls himself, as he recounts in his own biography. And this event in and of itself disrupted the same alliance. Besides, plague decimated the French army as much as the imperial one. Italy was totally devastated. At this point, actually, Hayreddin Barbarossa showed up off the coast of Rome, and at that point, during the sack and the plague spreading, there were practically no defenses. So the Turks could have actually entered Rome and also made it what you would think is the absolute worst even worse. But because of the plague, likely they did not do that as well. Admittedly, there was also a Genoese fleet on their tail, but this, in any case, tells you that this is the most depressing moment of the Italian wars. Things improved afterward. Also, after Pavia, actually, things were not so, especially from a strictly military point of view. And also in forms of later devastations, not as harsh. But the French army during the siege of Naples suffered of the plague that had spread across the peninsula. This forced capitulation at Aversa as well. And so it was really a disaster for everybody involved. Louis of Savoy and Margaret of Austria, Charles's aunt, famously enough, negotiated the Peace of Cambrai, where in 1529, out of exhaustion of all contendants fundamentally, in this sense sparing also Burgundy in the agreements. Essentially, the imperials did not force like their claims on the Duchy of Burgundy in France, but required at least Francis to abandon Naples, whereas we've seen the French army had also been disbanded, and in Milan itself by dynastic ties, while paying a substantial ransom for his sons that were still in exile. That Peace of Cambrai is also called the Ladies' Peace, exactly because of the central role of the two women as negotiators, and it did bring temporary respite in the broader picture. Another very important woman was Diane of Poitiers, that was entrusted by Francis to his own son during exile. Interestingly enough, the future Henry II, will maintain a relationship with this woman, who was consistently older than him. There are voices that Francis himself had an affair with her, but that's unconfirmed, and she would play an important role, in fact, in later French history. It's at this point that, according to pacts, Francis marries Eleanor. We are in 1530. This union produced no children. Eleanor proved a quiet consort who focused on charitable works and mediation attempts, never bearing children despite, in fact, this diplomatic pressure for an Habsburg Valois heir that, if you think about it, would have been insane. Obviously, this would have not been the central branch, but say something had happened to Charles's heir, things could have gone differently. Now, the death of Francis's mother in 1531 at Grès-sur-Loing marked a deep personal loss, as you can understand, as this woman had sort of long exercised like a great influence over French political affairs, aside obviously from the mother-son relations. This is something big, right, for Francis. Grès-sur-Loing is a site tied to Louise's later residences in the Ile-de-France region. I don't think it exists anymore as because during the French Revolution something quite hateful happened. But in general, as regent during Francis's absences, Louise had managed internal affairs with notable skill, drawing on her Savoyard connections that were very important as a balance straddling the Alps, but also general political education that, as we've seen, she was acquainted with ever since she was very young. After all these disasters, a period of reorganization ensued, with Francis reforming the French army, in part along, so this is said, but it's not really what happened, like Ottoman Janissary lines. At least there were these weird imitations between countries, but there wasn't like a structured reform for that matter. If anything, the most important experiment that I was talking about before were the provincial legions of 6,000 infantry each, trying to emphasize at least discipline and national recruitment over mercenaries. That will be an actual disaster. They would be degraded, demoted to some sort of provincial garrison, and not even as that, these forces would be particularly effective. But it's important to understand how during the progress of the Italian wars, there had been an obvious shift towards more professional, national-based forces, especially for the French that had never quite developed much of that, reducing also reliance on often unreliable foreign mercenaries as well. It was about time for France to step up towards something more consistent and nationally drawn, but it will take another generation before getting there, or a couple actually, before getting anywhere meaningful in this direction. The aforementioned legions, directly inspired from the Roman ones in Francis's great classical love, were raised from specific provinces like Normandy and Gascony. They received standardized training and equipment funded through increased taille collections, marking an early step toward a standing royal army independent of feudal levies. Again, this will fundamentally fail, but as an experiment in itself is quite interesting. Just France was not mature yet as a state to surpass like the fundamentally aristocratic-based feudal retinues and sort of general mercenary hiring that will achieve, in fact, only at the time of the Sun King with a much greater power concentration, as a matter of fact. The extinction of the Sforza line in 1535, with the Duchy of Milan passing toward imperial control, provided pretext for renewed action. As we were saying before, even after Pavia, you have this episodic continuation of the Italian wars with sort of smaller intensity, but still sort of important stakes. In 1536, in fact, French troops occupied Savoy and advanced to... Remember that Savoy was part of the Holy Roman Empire, right? So depending on the situation, obviously there was a greater alignment with France, let's say, but in general, right, the overall step into like this land equated to an infringement of imperial authority. And at this point, the French advanced to the Lombard frontier, in fact, prompting Charles V's invasion of Provence. Mediation by Pope Paul III secured the Truce of Nice in 1538, preserving French holdings in Turin without altering the broader Italian equilibrium. Remember to differentiate between these two distinct invasions of Provence, right, as we've seen before, and that's what eventually escalates to the French counterattack into Lombardy. The pattern is similar, but 1524, in fact, the year before Pavia, you have an imperial invasion of Provence with a failed siege of Marseille, right? But the 1536 invasion of Provence is also the one that Charles V personally led. And as you understand here, things do not radically over-escalate, right? At this point, the Truce of Nice, mediated aboard a papal ship, by the way, highlighted ongoing papal efforts to balance the rival powers. France's diplomacy in this era extended to unconventional alliances, including new overtures to German Protestant princes via the League of Schmalkalden in 1531. I made an entire video of how that was eventually crushed by Charles V, even though Protestantism could not be eradicated from northern Germany, and those princes remained somehow autonomous from the Habsburgs. You also have sustained contacts with Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan from 1520 to 1566, expanding his empire significantly and proving a major strategic counterweight to Habsburgic power. Right? Remember that in 1529, the Ottomans had attempted the conquest of Vienna, and there are actual letters between Francis and his mother that are actually openly talking about the fact that we're supporting the Turks in that endeavor. We're not really hoping. This is very interesting as a perspective for, in this sense, Christianity to lose, right? But they were naturally happy at the greater difficulty of the Habsburgs, and they explicitly say like that once Vienna had fallen into Turkish hands at that point, obviously everything would have changed in the history of Europe, but it would have had to be the French at that point to step into Italy and to, in order to stem Turkish expansionism. So this speaks volumes about the actual pressure that France found itself under from the Habsburgs, to the point of saying, okay, we have to first take those out. We want to survive, or always passing on the counteroffensive. In Italy, it had been the major theater, but this happened, as we've seen, a bit all around. For telling you how delicate the balance really was, and at that point, like, had the Turks seized Vienna, it's obvious that they would have vied for Italy, they would have had an unprecedented leverage, and then the French would have immediately had to step into Italy to clash against the Turks. And so this is incredibly important because at that point the French would have acted as the new empires at some point, especially during the Middle Ages, had actually done. And so you realize that this conveniency policy, and so this impium fidus with the Turk was grounded in actual political and strategic concreteness and intelligence. It wasn't fundamentally like a whim, like because the French were bad that wanted sort of Christianity to sink. This was not their point to begin with. Interestingly enough, agents like Frangipani and Antonio Rincon, and I just made a video about them actually, facilitated negotiations from 1526 onward, yielding commercial privileges for French merchants in Ottoman waters by 1536, as well as mutual military coordination against Habsburg interests. As you know, the French will actually allow the Ottoman fleet to repose in Marseille with great horror of the local inhabitants. I also made a video about the siege of Nice, interestingly enough. So these Franco-Turkish ties, while pragmatic for balancing power, also drew unavoidable criticism across Christendom. Everybody knew what France was doing, and Charles V was naturally desperate because it was part of a broader, as we've seen in global and metaphysical view, that the idea of uniting Christian forces against Islam. And there wasn't internationally any way at the time to sort of justify a Franco-Turkish alliance, especially at the detriment of the Holy Roman Empire. And so probably the unity of Christianity as such, especially in times of Reformation, and from the side of France that was nominally and de facto quite strongly a Catholic country herself. Right? It's obvious that in imperial propaganda, Charles V pointed out how difficult the situation was and how sort of incorrect, to say the least, France's behavior really was. As we just pointed out, Francis had actually to gain from the alliance with Constantinople. In fact, this enabled French naval operations with Barbarossa in the Western Mediterranean from 1533 to 1534. Right? It's sort of strange how we recently has randomly talked about these topics in the past few days. This always happens with Schwerpunkt as we jump around various topics that, however, always sort of agglutinate themselves. Hayreddin Barbarossa was the famed Ottoman admiral conducting joint operations with the French that challenged Habsburg naval dominance in the Mediterranean. The French allowed Barbarossa's fleet to winter in Toulon in 1543-1544. Marseille was not the only port we mentioned before that would be multiple times used by the Turks as allowed by the French. By the way, it's quite interesting that these pirates, these corsairs, actually had to behave themselves relatively well, right? Considering that they were in fact Ottoman privateers and so on. So very much owing to Barbarossa's effectiveness as a leader, right? On this occasion, Barbarossa used the French ports for raids on Habsburg shipping, while Francis gained intelligence on imperial troop movements from the Ottoman side. So it was a great work of intelligence. That's why also Rincon was assassinated, as we recently explained. The fourth and final major war against Charles V opened in 1542, following, in fact, the same assassination of the French envoys Cesare Fregoso and Antonio Rincon, attributed to imperial agents. You want to appreciate that Rincon was Castilian. It was, again, we've seen before, the Bourbon was a French traitor, so to say, passing to the imperials. Here you have a Castilian that had defected to the French and was assassinated in Italy because of this. Francis then declared hostilities on July the 12th, 1542, dispatching armies under his sons to the Low Countries and Roussillon, So we're at the diametric opposite of the French corners, at least northeast, southwest, while coordinating with Ottoman forces in the Mediterranean at the same time. Consider that the Ottomans routinely harassed the Italian coastline, so creating problems for Habsburgic-held territories that required also very large sums of money to fortify the coast, to man adequate amount of war galleys, etc. So this is a very interesting chapter in early modern warfare. We'll talk about better at some point. Initial gains during this campaign dissipated amid financial exhaustion, with Charles V and Henry VIII coordinating invasions of France that reached within leagues of the same Paris by 1544. The French victory at Ceresole in Italy, however, offered limited consolation, leading to the treaties of Crépy and Ardres in 1544-1546. These accords effectively ended Italian claims on both sides. At this point, the so-called Italian wars will shift to the Netherlands. There is also the abandonment of Burgundy from the side of Charles. Francis secures in this temporary Savoyard positions as well, with this frontier land of the empire. The death of his favored son Charles, however, Duke of Orléans in 1544, compounded the personal toll. Right? Just imagine being a monarch and having on your shoulders the destiny of your kingdom and suffering these massive personal blows in your family. It's something unspeakable. Militarily speaking, the Battle of Ceresole in northern Italy demonstrated continued French tactical capabilities despite overall strategic pressures and the de facto pulling out of France of Italy at this point, right? So this great attempt, this great French exuberance stemming from the final stages of late medieval French territorial recomposition had been effectively thwarted by the broader Habsburg power. Ceresole was fought on April the 11th, 1544, and the French were under the command of François de Bourbon, achieving this success using, at this point on their own, pike and shot tactics, like pikemen, arquebusiers against imperial troops. Here, definitely, European warfare was further homogenizing. And the rest that follows is just the consequence of the strategic exhaustion and forced peace negotiations, because war definitely costs too much, and these campaigns can do definitely just so far, right? Europe had been exhausting itself after all. After all these wars, they had a major structural toll, and that's why there is less force properly to conduct larger wars. Throughout all this, Francis maintained a permanent national army, a nucleus of the same. Remember that the French were among the very first to establish. On some books you will find like to be the first. Actually, the same French sources explain that this had started from Milan back in the mid 14th century before. Also, in fact, the French that basically developed this also in parallel, but on their inspiration, Philippe de Commines says. So when we talk about a permanent national army, does not mean a modern national army like the one of Louis XIV. It's still basically a medieval system. Like there aren't other systems around. Even pike and shot tactics are fundamentally a tactical model. They don't tell you how much was being actually a royal force, like a permanently maintained force, and also in that case, it's not quite necessarily on a truly permanent fashion, right? There weren't units that simply survived till sort of later time in history, so we can say this was fully permanent, right? So we should make more videos about this because people are generally confused, but especially the Ancien Regime model, essentially a royal corps plus essentially mercenaries as the backbone and levy militias as the numerical majority. Even though militias were, in the sense, mostly used to garrison places rather than on campaign, is fundamentally how armies will remain until, in fact, and by also different degrees of, in fact, of private and aristocratic control, until the age of Louis XIV. and France will pioneer the change. At this point, France does not quite do that. Just like England had lagged behind after the end of the 100 Years' War in terms of continental military development, France does slightly. At least the Italian wars represent a very heavy setback. Then you have the French Wars of Religion that I made multiple videos on. So there is this sort of lag in time that every once in a while happens in French history, that, however, does bring to a very interesting military development, especially in the first half of the 17th century, in fact, before the Sun King's takeover. Right, much of his extraordinary reforms could have not been carried out without already a substantial military culture. Of course, stemmed also from these times in the Middle Ages and beyond. Francis, as you've seen, had prioritized still conventional ways of fighting, artillery, this provincial mercenaries from Gascony, for example, at the same time engaging in typical Renaissance relations, developing a sophisticated diplomatic network to counter Habsburgic propaganda and secure alliances. Internally, Francis advanced absolutist tendencies, right? Remember that no quote-unquote absolute monarch from history books was ever absolute, right? The only absolute state, with the state as the sole source of law, is actually what is birthed by the Code Napoleon, and it's exactly birthed also on the ashes of the Ancien regime. So what is better to say is that, of course, Francis was a traditional ruler. He had an autocratic tendency, monarchic, aristocratic bias. There was a feudal establishment, etc. And the attempt here was to concentrate further power that, however, would have gone at the benefit of overall of France to the capacity of defending herself and also projecting her power further. Francis employed the formula carte le notre bon plaisir in edicts and establishing exceptional tribunals to curb noble independence among bishops and seigneurs. So much of this sort of absolute power was mostly being pushed at the expenses of the higher estates of the kingdom. As you know, in the French Parliament were the still very elite in nature, given the nature of French society. The court under Francis evolved into a lavish center of power, with favorites and the Conseil des Affaires concentrating authority. Financial innovations included the Trésor de l'Épargne for concentrated receipts and expenditures alongside sales of offices and forced loans to meet wartime demands, mostly financial needs, obviously enough. The taille that we mentioned multiple times here as a general contribution doubled between 1517 and 1543, supplemented by new revenues from communal rents and office venality. And despite these measures, deficits, of course, persisted, reflecting the strains of international commitments and courtly expenditures on castles like, for example, the one of Blois, Chambord, Fontainebleau, and the Louvre's transformation from fortress to Renaissance palace that really happens at this point in the heart of Paris. Right, there is a quite interesting sort of urbanistic knowledge that we have of the city at the time, and if you have visited the Loire Ballet castles, you know of the magnificent, the splendor of these mansions that remain. Also, in fact, not just royal residences, as they had also historically been before further architectural escalation at this point, but it will also be maintained by the crown, as we've seen also at the time of Maurice de Saxe. Like, some of these residences could be offered to as a compensation for the marshals of France. Historically, Paris had been dangerous, and it will remain until the front, and also as the French Revolution really exemplifies. So the Capetians had preferred to reside different times in these fairly isolated castles that were far away, in fact, from concentration of potentially rebellious forces, even though, of course, their presence in Paris and other important cities was also required. The annual French royal budget under Francis ballooned to over 4 million livres tournois by the 1540s, with war costs consuming up to 3/5, forcing repeated devaluations of the currency and sales of crown lands. Imagine after Pavia, for example. Chambord, with its distinctive Renaissance architecture and double helix staircase inspired by Italian designs in Fontainebleau, transformed into a major artistic center, with Italian influences exemplifying Francis's vision of a cultured monarchy on the basis of classical revival. Francis's patronage extended to founding the Imprimerie Royale and the Collège de France for Hebrew, Greek, and Latin instruction, while protecting the royal library at Blois and Fontainebleau. Right, this is a new Renaissance also to the extent of the translation of texts coming, for example, at this point from the same Ottoman Empire's diplomatic gifts to France because of their alliance, and actually a strong presence of French personnel. There were instructors, observers, all kind of diplomats in the Ottoman Empire that will remain. In fact, their almost constant presence. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Rosso, Primaticcio, Cellini, that we mentioned also before, killing Bourbon, and so having there quite a special place at Francis's court. And Andrea del Sarto, these all Italian artists, received invitations, contributing, in fact, to Fontainebleau's decorations and the accumulation of masterpieces. During all those campaigns in Italy, needless to say, as it will continue historically, think about under Napoleon, the French had been looting their share of Italian art and of classical masterpieces and so on. Leonardo, famously enough, spent his final years in France at Amboise under Francis's invitation, bringing works including the Mona Lisa, that is still, in fact, held at Louvre for this reason, and embodying Francis's commitment to attracting Italian genius. After all, France lacked exactly the level of dynamism and of technological edge. Having a large artillery park does not mean that you have the best artillery. It means that you have a big state, right? And so we have often described how in early modern Europe, actually, Germany and Italy are the most technologically advanced countries out there, but they're also the most obviously fragmented, right? So that means something. And in general, in Francis's mind, as much as the one of other French rulers, but probably in his view at the peak of it, Italy was nothing but an extension of France. And I'm not kidding, as a view. Like, that simply was home. Like, it was to be conquered, to be controlled. And there were all the historical premises, motivations for that. Leonardo arrived in France in late 1516 with 3 paintings and numerous notebooks, receiving a generous pension of 700 gold crowns and advising on palace designs and canal projects near Blois before dying in May 1519 at Clos-Lucé. Poets like Marot and Du Bellay found support alongside humanists including Guillaume Boudet and Lefebvre de Talpe. Exploration initiatives under Francis challenged Iberian monopolies as well. France did not have the same level of Atlantic projection of especially the Portuguese, right? But in general, they had an obvious potential for that. As you know, there is all, and we will study, we partially observed it in the series about the Armada, all a very interesting military history of proxies, of privateers fighting one another in the Americas, in fact, under the flags of this various power. You have, under the French, Giovanni da Verrazzano, yet one of the many Italian explorers connected with American discoveries, claimed, in fact, North American coasts in 1524 as New Angoulême, in naturally deference to the Valois-Angoulême branch of the Capetian house that Francis incarnated. You have Jacques Cartier's voyages in 1534-1541. We talk about Cartier partially in our series about early Canadian warfare, even though we didn't push so early as him, but obviously we mentioned him for that. He mapped famously the St. Lawrence and established proper claims in Canada. Verrazzano explored the Atlantic coast, including the site of future New York. Cartier's expeditions laid groundwork for French claims in what became New France. These voyages represented early French efforts to establish a presence in the New World, focusing on the St. Lawrence River region and laying foundations to future colonial endeavors. Cartier specifically made 3 voyages, bringing back Iroquoian captives from Stadacona in 1535, and establishing a short-lived settlement at Charlesbourg Royal in 1541, while searching unsuccessfully for the kingdom of Saguenay and precious metals. There were all legends regarding these El Dorados that, as you know, also and especially the Spanish went after in Southern America. Francis's religious policies reflected shifting priorities. Initially tolerant of evangelical currents, as we were recording before, under his sister's influence, by the way, he shielded figures associated with the Mill Circle. Margaret was a noted author and patron of Protestants, and this was scandalous enough, like as being the sister of the same king, and so a formally Catholic king. She influenced early openness to Protestant, to Calvinist ideas even. However, it was clear, especially in a country like France, like this fringe and radical elements could not sustain in any meaningful way a continuity with the older kingdom and the monarchy. The affair of the Placard in 1534 with its anti-Catholic posters prompted a reversal, in fact, leading to censorship, burnings, and the 1540 Edict of Fontainebleau that dealt with heresy. Persecutions intensified, in fact, including the 1545 massacre of the Valdensians at Mérindol and Cabrères under Cardinal Tournan's sway. These were, as you know, the Valdensians were a very old movement from the High Middle Ages that had, however, nested in the mountains of Savoy. I also made a video about their guerrilla during the War of the League of Augsburg, so more than a century later. But these normally sided with at least part of the Protestants in this anti-Catholic, in this sense, mostly anti-monarchic sense. As we've seen, it's not like Francis would shy away from alliances with Protestant princes and the Islamic Ottomans. However, these were tactical, contingent measures, right? There had been, especially from an international standpoint, the primacy of the raison d'etat over confessional unity in a way, but this was not true within France, right? This is also quite interesting because we think of the post-Westphalian world being mostly associated with, I don't like the term post-Westphalian. I think it's sort of very cliche, categorical, and it stems also from a very poor understanding, not much of history of religion, but probably political and strategical understanding, in the sense also sort of general studies on the world, like it projects a wrong opinion of what the world allegedly was and is not anymore. There isn't such a thing. It was always like that. If you study, of course, the age of Francis I, you will immediately find that out, that Francis was a Catholic monarch and ruled over the most Catholic France. But of course, he would support Protestants in Germany against the Habsburgs, as we've seen before with the Schmalkaldic League, by seeking also their vote during the imperial election. And of course, the Turks helped France in preserving her political and territorial compaction under the relentless pressure of many enemies that often joined in coalitions against the Valois. However, in this sense, it's wrong to simply think that Francis was just an unprejudiced, modern, this cold, opportunistic sovereign, with understanding how deeply felt the traditional Catholic identity really was. Yes, admittedly, there was this initial calculation: what do we do about the Reformation? Like, do we side with the reformers because this would give us an edge temporarily? Right, many of them would side with us in different regions. These debates surely happen at some point. If you had the Habsburgs against you and the papacy and the empire very often trying, in fact, to curb your power, we've seen before it took Marignano to actually boost further autonomy as far as the Gallic Church, the Gallican Church was concerned. And so you would think like this was truly devoid of scruple. But as a matter of fact, it was a way to maintain power, and there was no intent eventually to support any of this internal fringe and heterodoxy, for the simple fact that the foundations of the French kingdom were unequivocally Catholic in the primigenial sense of the term. If you look at the video I made on the French Wars of Religion, that is incredibly telling in this sense, you realize that the entire enterprise was of the Protestants, of the Huguenots, was ill-fated for the simple fact that at no point in the decades of warfare, because by the way, there is this early phase at the end of the 16th century we narrowly called the French Wars of Religion, but there were different clashes later on, also in the 17th century, and as you know, until the final revocation of the Edict of Nantes, Huguenots did really represent like a different country within the country. But there had not been even a single moment in which northeastern France, the core of the French monarchy, by far the most powerful, the most populated areas, the most developed ones, etc., ever embraced Protestantism. Ever. Right? It wasn't like there actually were some Protestant. No. Protestants, unsurprisingly, were located radically overly concentrated in the south, in Occitania, right? Confessional clashes were in this sense a pretext for some elements of the French monarchy that had yet to fully compact in the also even more rigid way that eventually you will see during the Republic, the Empire, etc., in terms of nation state and sort of this homogenization, also normalization, so to say, of the Languedoc. At the advantage of the Langue d'Oil. And the heretical matrix there was not compatible in any way with the concept of utmost monarchic power that France incarnated. A great Orthodox country, fully stabilized, fully based on general establishment consensus, on a specific, say, an orthodoxy that was shared by the same life of the regime, right? Calvinism was not made for the type of French society. Land owning with sort of increasing urban siding with the necessity of a monarchy, a sort of ever more consolidated estates hierarchy represented in this sort of very courageous, but in fact not particularly threatening parliament, was in fact giving ever more trust and powers to the king, unlike what was happening in England, for example. But that also from quite a while. Again, that's a mold that had started from a very long time. We tend not to see that like that. And the reason, by the way, why the placards incident on October the 17th, 1534 brought eventually to the suppression of Protestantism in France is that this movement had included posters announcing the mass affixed even to the king's chamber door at Amboise. It was already born as a radical ideology. I made entire videos explaining how, of course, all these movements historically had always been anti-establishment to begin with. They anthropologically are, they spiritually are, they metaphysically are. Right, and Francis could not tolerate this, any possible sympathy towards these movements in a sort of edgy fashion to provoke the Pope or the Emperor, died as this event occurred, and Francis ordered mass arrest, as well as 6 public executions in Paris, marking the start of systematic heresy persecution that executed over 20 individuals in the following months as well, which was not even this much, actually. In Protestant lands, you found much worse. In fact, the same idea of Bloody Mary and all this, obviously the papistic mythology, anti-papistic mythology, the Black Legion of the Spaniards, of the Inquisition. People have no clue that really the Protestant countries were the least developed, the more brutal, the least stable, the less rich, as a matter of fact. And so it was much better to be properly judged by the Inquisition than even normal lay tribunal. In fact, there were some people who cursed against God in that way when they were caught doing something, because they would have been sent to the Inquisition immediately, and they knew that they would have received a much better treatment than normal. So actually, the Inquisition was the best tribunal existing at the time, and you really wanted to be sort of evaluated by that with very scarce death sentences, as opposed to what normally happened in lay justice. And so here we should appreciate the role of France as a true civilizational bulwark of Catholic civilization, even when Francis was flirting with the Protestants outside of France and the Ottoman Turks. Again, that's why I said at the beginning of the video, we must contextualize each of these dynamics, because they didn't simply occur for no reason. It's easy to say, oh, look at those guys were bad because they did that. No, right? There is a mass difference between France, for example, I don't know, some northern German prince that decided to perpetuate a state of national disintegration, just not to be told by the Habsburg what they could do in their land, right? And also lagging behind, historically speaking, right? This is not like the English helping the Turks. This is something sort of for even more cynical interest and sort of more distant one. It's not like it happened in similar ways also in these other countries, but France must be, from a perspective of sort of encirclement, should be perhaps be understood a bit more in this. France's personal piety coexisted, by the way, with courtly hedonism, which was yet another way to actually show power and monarchic strength. Admittedly, Francis was a quite, again, promiscuous individual. A court without women, he said, resembled a year without spring. And this did not necessarily sort of mean what he sort of saw as a sentimental way of life, but indeed this referred to courtesans and to the general spirit of the most libertine Renaissance courts. Marriages, as we've seen before, to Claude and Eleanor produced heirs, at least in the first case, with Henry II succeeding, famously enough, though several children died young. This was, again, absolutely normal, as much as Claude's sort of physical exhaustion after, in fact, having born Francis 7 children, several of whom did reach adulthood but faced also early deaths, as we've seen before with the Duke of Orleans. Henry II, however, continued the Valois line, famously enough. Francis's physical presence, tall, robust, with a prominent nose, as we said before, projected regal vitality for the sort of beauty standards of the era in particular. Though later ailments, including urinary issues and possible syphilis, confined him increasingly to a litter. All right. By the way, you have this unforgiving, and especially if you look at also Henry VIII, these are were I consider again incredibly sort of physically gifted men, even for the standards of the nobility at the time. But obviously they also exhausted themselves. This is always the idea you get when they went at war and they spent entire sort of months on campaign. The exertions psychophysically were incredibly consuming, but also their lifestyle, their diet, their excesses would bring to obesity, to all kind of problems. In fact, by the 1540s, Francis suffered recurrent fevers, abscesses, These things were also normal in general for people, but you have also severe gout that required him to be carried in a litter during campaigns, with autopsy reports later noting kidney and liver complications. So you have this uric acids in your legs. This is normally coming from the diet of this, and not much the excess of meat per se, but it's mostly the lack of fresh fruit or certain imbalances in the diet. You have, in terms of excesses, Charles V did not live too long, right, after all, but also died with less physical complications overall. Like, apparently he used this sort of German practice to drink huge glasses of frozen beer as soon as he woke up. Something insane. Apparently he drank an incredibly large amount of alcohol without getting drunk. He also sort of ate a lot. It's an interesting character. And Charles V is also not, he did not become obese or have this kind of problem. So you have very strange outcomes in this. And it's fascinating, especially to compare these rulers, because, again, they're very much their own era, aren't they? Francis died at Rambouillet on March the 31st, 1547, commending the kingdom to his son, with words praising its loyal nobility and obedient people. And so there is something edifying about the description of these deaths. Some are very standardized for the era. Consider that courtly rituals were incredibly regulated. There was a very strong etiquette already, and courts were all over Europe were competing regarding this. But we can imagine this having been, of course, his intention, and of course the various heirs were very early on instructed on their duties in the practice, politics of war, social issues. Rambouillet was a residence southwest of Paris. He spent there his last days amid declining health. Francis' tomb at Saint-Denis, a beautiful one designed by Philibert Delorme and executed by Pierre Bontemps, alongside Claude's. It's a beautiful tomb, but they're side by side. And it's one of the few that survived, actually, as the iconoclasm of the revolution commemorated a reign that blended martial ambition, cultural patronage, institutional consolidation, leaving France with enhanced royal authority and a distinctive Renaissance imprint that definitely did owe a lot to Francis' life. And in a way or another, we always come back to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, of Montjoie, in our imperial Catholic traditional inquiries. I will not actually specify how, while the tomb of Francis and Claude still exists, what happened to their bodies, but unfortunately I think if you know what happened at a point. But what matters is truly the transcendence there. Like, nothing really gets destroyed in the earthly dimension. It is fallen anyway. And that's exactly the point. It's not transfigured yet. And so they will be resurrected in the flesh. And this is the landscape also you have to make. If you have really to think, like, the cultural horizon of these monarchs is truly Saint-Denis, right? At a deep level. Like, there were some, you have ironic anecdotes such as Louis XIV not liking the Louvre because he was forced to look at Saint-Denis from the distance, and he was superstitious, and he preferred, obviously, this splendidly rebuilt Versailles. But truly, aside from this personal tastes, you realize as a French king, like, it's impossible to even explain what it would have meant to be a French king, up to fairly recently in time, but even more, in fact, for someone like Francis, like, to live and die within this world. I think that, in the sense, the centrality of Paris in Europe as a cultural capital, let's be honest, Paris, Rome, and Prague are truly like the cultural hearts of Europe in different ways. Like, other cities are very important and they compare, obviously, enough, but let's say something about the cultural meaning of Europe in these cities that is not sort of random or anecdotal. Well, looking at, and I can tell you by experience, of course, that looking at Francis's elaborate tomb at Saint-Denis, you just realize how forward-thinking even a monarch like this really was, how much, but in a still traditional way, right? Representing the grandeur of his era, but also the staunch dramatic contrast between the sort of the two natures. And so the bannière qui ne meurt jamais, and he said the lower remain, like the becoming one, right? If these peoples had, especially during the Renaissance, it was a moment of great pain, of incredible pain. Like we celebrate the Renaissance obviously because of the exteriority of it and the material dimension, but let's say this was an incredibly painful moment, as we've seen today also during the Italian wars and all these issues connected with the Reformation and endless contrasts and death in ways that it's difficult for us even to reconcile with the splendid idea of the Renaissance that were mostly propinated. And so while visiting France, you definitely have the sense of that age, of that time, right? Francis's legacy as a Renaissance monarch endures through his architectural projects, artistic collections. At some point, as we were saying before, he went almost bankrupt because he had to have an Italian style, completely uniformed with royal insignia, covers of all his manuscripts out there. And so you have there, because by the way, printing still existed, but there were certain collages that were still handmade for the sheer level of sort of the decoration and craft that mattered, having the Lily of France and all covers in this beautiful studio. Here in the pictures, I think I gave you enough of an idea of the splendor, of the aesthetics, right, of Francis's style at this point. But it ultimately reflected, remember that, the strengthening of a concentrated royal power that influenced subsequent French absolutism. Francis managed to preserve French integrity even in the failure in the Italian wars and the repeated attempts today. We haven't even digressed too much into military matters. I will actually make another video, surely, these biographies from the military side of the story. You know that I made some military biographies already of some famous characters that, however, I covered just the military side of. But really, there is a lot going on. Also from France, like the attempt at invading England, the Scottish connection. Today, we didn't talk much about this at all because the video is already too long the way it is. And so this is just like a general introduction to Francis. We don't pretend this to be anywhere sort of complete, right? But we must make these videos exactly to provide with the overall context for so many other sort of episodes that will deal indeed with other specific aspects of Francis' reign. You understand how big this is, how grandiose in scale Francis' reign was, to the point of us, just making too few in order to remember him. And remembering is important. In tradition, remembrance is something that really brings back to life. This is the theological, metaphysical, doctrinal meaning of remembrance. And I think for the 16th century, I haven't created videos like Modern French Warfare, yes, but Modern France, is there a playlist? Actually, yes, interestingly enough. And so this will go straight into it, but I fear that actually I made that there are much more videos on Modern French War. No, not really. Okay. So I thought to have made more about France, and the more I go on, the more I realize how much I actually must do. But we surpassed with last video the other day on sort of Provenza, Aden, etc. 100 videos for 16th century history that we absolutely must accelerate on. And I think really that this chapter on Francis was very much due for such a project. Today, we didn't talk at all about Catherine de' Medici, that, as you know, married Francis's heir, And Francis apparently had an enormous trust in this woman. He instructed her in the feats of practical governance that she would exemplarily display during the time of the wars of religion. In fact, it's impossible to make a video on Francis I and not to at least refer to her, even though she's more active later in French and European politics. There are very interesting dynamics here, not just much that this marriage with a collateral branch of the Medici, and in the most aristocratic, say the Medici were definitely richer than many French noblemen. In this sense, she was despised because she was called like the banker of some sort, and instead she turned out to be one of the firmest, most this is resembling in part Francis's style of governance. Rulers de facto, right, during the regency and sort of the various quick succession of her old dead, in fact, sons on the French throne. But indeed, as we've seen in the video about the French wars of religion, we talk about her mostly there. We can make other videos about that, and it's not much of a problem here. We also talk about Henry II, and again, we can't make everything in a single video. Really last mention, because there are so many anecdotes on Francis, but one very important aspect that you have not surely noticed in the pictures, if you have never been aware of that, say why that there is a salamander as Francis' personal coat of arms, and this is an occult symbol. We've seen it also in Hermetism, and this is definitely the time of classical revival, alchemy, blossoming, and so on. Naturally, the salamander has in heraldry and in the ancients, or in the bestiaries of medieval Europe, etc., the property of resisting fire, as the phoenix actually regenerates itself from its own ashes after burning. The salamander goes through fire intact, right? And this was to represent, of course, a perennial character of Francis' rule, in line with imperial Catholic tradition. And there is this very funny incident where in one of Charles V's visits to France, because as we've seen today, like this did happen. There were actually cordial relations between them. They actually hated each other, but in many ways they also felt akin to one another for many reasons in imperial royalty and beyond. And there was a residence hastily constructed, by the way, by Francis in order to host. You see all these financial shortcomings to host the emperor, who almost got himself killed as part of the ceiling fell. All these kind of weird things, and fascinatingly enough, Charles had his own bedroom in a section of this building, and during the night, Francis had a giant salamander statue display, located properly in front of the window, so that in the following morning, when Charles opened the window, his servants had it done for him, he saw this massive salamander in front of him, and that speaks volumes about the character of Francis, and always this necessity of hyper competition, of power display, that is definitely part of his here. And so, just for the record of what you've seen throughout this video as well, and just for telling you how much there is that we're not descending into the details of, but that is quite relevant. Quite interesting stories about sort of Francis' love affairs. But let's stop it here for today. Very well. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.